The 18th of June, 1968.
June 18th, 1862.
We are releasing this episode on June 18th because this is a significant date in two Medal of Honor stories we told you in the past on this podcast. In fact, June 18th is an important date in the story of the very first recipients of the Medal of Honor, Andrews Raiders during the Civil War. It is also an important date in the story of the last person to be awarded the Medal of Honor, the late Vietnam War veteran Captain Larry Taylor. And both of those stories have major ties to Chattanooga, Tennessee.
I had a shade more than 2,000 combat missions, and I never refused a mission, and none of my men ever refused a mission. You were scared most of the time, but that's what we did.
My name is Josh Rowe, and this is Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. The first recipients of the Medal of Honor were awarded on March 25th, 1863 during the Civil War. On that day, 6 members of a group called Andrews Raiders were awarded the Medal of Honor. Those raiders stole a train in North Georgia in an attempt to destroy the railroad between Atlanta and Chattanooga. That mission ultimately failed and the men were captured. I told this story along with historian and author Brad Quinlan and several other people in a recent episode of this podcast called The Mysterious Cases of Privates Shadrach and Wilson. I re-edited a couple of clips from that episode to play for you here. That story begins with a meeting between the leader of the group, civilian scout James Andrews, and General O.M. Mitchell, who had set up camp near Shelbyville, Tennessee.
He wanted to attack and take over Chattanooga. It's an important rail line. It's a river.
So, the plan.
They would take 22 Union soldiers.
Plus another civilian who happened to be at the camp. So 2 civilians and 22 soldiers total left Shelbyville on the mission.
They would go in small groups of 3 and 4.
Head to Georgia.
Steal a train called the General.
But by the time they got on that train, those 24 men were now down to 20. 2 civilians, 18 soldiers. But the plan, it was still intact. The Raiders were going to race north on the train and rip up the railroad.
And then the Confederates couldn't get reinforcements from Marietta up to Chattanooga.
Then the Union takes Chattanooga and ends the war quickly. Easy. No problem.
Well, everything fell apart very quickly.
Oh.
William Fuller, the conductor of the General, he started chasing the train and screaming, "They're stealing my train, they're stealing my train."
A lot of that falling apart happened near and in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And today, you can find many of the places where some of the worst of the falling apart happened.
The engine ran out of wood and water at Ringgold.
There's still today a marker right next to the railroad where the train still runs today. The marker sits right next to a road on one side, Georgia State Route 151, or Ooltewah-Ringgold Road. The railroad is on the other side of the marker and is surrounded by a few scattered small homes. The marker tells the story of Andrews Raiders and the Great Locomotive Chase. The pursuit then was at such a rapid pace that serious damage to the railroad by the Raiders was impossible. The General was abandoned by the Raiders on account of lack of fuel and the close pursuit.
They had to abandon the train.
They were just under 20 miles from Chattanooga.
So they actually then were captured over the course of the next weeks.
And that is when this story takes a dark turn for the Raiders.
Taken here in Chattanooga in a prison.
There is another historical marker on Lookout Street in downtown Chattanooga that marks the spot where that jail stood. The Raiders described the jail as a dungeon, handcuffed and chained together by the neck. No windows, so no sunlight. They were crawled over by rats and mice. Terrible situation. Now, during the few weeks the Raiders were in the jail in Chattanooga, James Andrews, the civilian leader, was court-martialed there. The book, Stealing the General by Russell S. Bonds, gives us a specific location of the trial in Civil War-era Chattanooga. It's hard to imagine that scene as you walk through the downtown streets of the city today. So back in 1862, in the corner of 4th and Market in downtown Chattanooga, that was the location of the old National Guard Armory building. In that building is where they held the court-martial for James Andrews. He was tried as a spy and convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, and he was hanged there in Atlanta, Georgia. That spot now where the National Guard Armory used to sit, there's now a Mexican restaurant there. For years, it was an Applebee's. Andrews was taken to Atlanta and was hanged alone.
On June 7th, 1862.
The rest of the jailed Raiders were moved to Atlanta as well. 7 more of them,
including Shadrach and Wilson, were hung on June 18th, 1862.
Now 7 men stood with their boots planted firmly in this Atlanta, Georgia dirt on these final moments of their short lives.
Philip Gebhard Shadrach was a very religious man.
One of his comrades described him like this:
almost being obnoxious. When he was being taken out to be hung, he turned to the group and he said, "I'm not yet ready to meet my Jesus."
On June 18, 1862, Shadrach and the 6 others were hanged near the old Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta. If you want to listen to that full episode, I have a link in the show notes of this episode. Of the 24 Andrews Raiders, 22 were soldiers, 2 civilians. Those 2 civilians were among the 8 people who were executed on June 18, 1862. 8 others escaped from prison and eventually made it back into Union territory. 6 remained in Confederate prisons until they were part of a prisoner exchange, and those 6 were the first recipients of the Medal of Honor. Eventually, 19 of the Andrews Raiders were awarded the medal, and there's currently a push to get 2 more of those soldiers the Medal of Honor. Both of those men, Philip Shadrach, as we mentioned in the clip earlier, and George Davenport Wilson, were publicly executed in the streets of Atlanta, Georgia on June 18, 1862. In September of last year, Captain Larry Taylor was awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. Taylor was a Cobra helicopter pilot during the Vietnam War, and he rescued 4 men in a combat action that happened on June 18, 1968. Last year, on the show, Captain Taylor and Dave Hill, the only remaining survivor from the men who were rescued that night, told the story of what happened.
We found them and we went to work clearing a hole for them.
So there were 2 of these helicopters on the mission. Each had thousands of rounds and loaded with rockets as well. So they joined the fight, trying to create enough space for the LRP team to escape. That's until they
began to run out of rockets and run out of ammunition, and you couldn't see anything.
So the soldiers on the ground are in trouble. The helicopter out of ammunition, and they can't see. Also,
my fuel light was on. That means you got 20 minutes to go somewhere.
So the situation, it's getting much worse.
I needed to think of something innovative to pull these guys out because they were going to die. There were 4 of them, and they were surrounded by about 60 people in a ring.
So Larry calls in for more artillery, and part of the village starts to catch fire.
It took their mind off of shooting at us, and so they quit shooting at us.
He realizes if he has a chance to get those men out, this is it.
I said, all right, blow your claymore mines, and when you do, start running on an azimuth of 135 degrees. Run out in what you think is 100 yards and lay down.
And again, he can't really see them, so he hopes what they think is 100 yards is the same thing that he thinks is 100 yards.
Flared and landed and set it down in the dark. Then I nearly sat down on top of them.
He did just what he said he did. He landed his helicopter in the middle of a firefight. And these helicopters, the Cobras, they're also called gunships. They move fast, are loaded with guns and ammo.
It was only 36 inches wide. Matter of fact, you had to wear a shoulder holster because you couldn't get your butt in the seat with a 45 on your hip.
It has two seats, one in front and one behind. These helicopters are not made to move troops, so once Larry lands the helicopter in the dark, in a field, in a firefight, these soldiers don't have any place to sit or ride in the helicopter. So what do? Well, here is Dave Hill. Dave Hill is one of the LRPs who had been in that firefight, who just ran 100 yards, fell to the ground, and now a Cobra helicopter is about to land on him.
All of a sudden we feel this downdraft of wind, and here comes Taylor's Cobra, and he's landing.
Hill says nobody told him what was about to happen.
Taylor just figured if he landed, we'd figure a way to latch ourselves onto the aircraft.
So two jumped on one side of the Cobra, and Dave Hill and another soldier jumped onto the now empty rocket pods on the other side.
And rode it like a horse backwards.
Larry Taylor lifted those four soldiers out of that battle, out of danger. He saved their lives that night.
Took us up to about 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet out of small arms range. Took us to the Saigon water treatment plant.
Roughly an 18-mile ride.
It was kind of a magic carpet ride that we got paid to ride.
Now, typically on these missions, there was another helicopter that would carry soldiers out of danger, designed for troop transport. But that night, that helicopter had a technical problem and had to go back to the base camp. So what Larry did prior to that, there was no training for it. And as far as this group is aware, there was not another rescue like it in the Vietnam War.
I went on and had other missions between this incident and when I went home. But it was never quite the same. When you're young, you basically feel like, and particularly doing a job in an elite unit, you feel immortal. And I found out that night we're not immortal.
Just an incredible story. Captain Taylor was originally awarded the Silver Star for his part in the rescue. Dave Hill and several other people worked for years to get that Silver Star upgraded to the Medal of Honor. Captain Taylor was awarded the Medal of Honor 55 years after that combat action on September 5th, 2023. Captain Taylor passed away in January of this year. Next time on the show, I'll spend more time on Andrews Raiders with a conversation with Jennifer Sweet, a descendant of Raider Philip Shadrack's family. That's on our next episode of Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast is a production of NewsChannel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.